Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. Today we have another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 46th deck and it's titled Monster Stomper. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. Now, before we get into the actual deck tech, I do want to very quickly highlight some ways that you can follow us, you can support us, you can reach out to us. So we have Twitter, Reddit, if you are interested in reaching out to us. We try to post updates there as much as possible. You can send us an email at dungeonlearnersguide@gmail.com. If you have any questions or any suggestions for videos, these are the best places to reach out to us. And then if you are interested in supporting our content, we do have an affiliate link through TCG Player that you can click on. It'll be in the link. The link will be in the description below. And then, of course, if you are interested in supporting us directly, we do have a Patreon account. You can donate a little bit of money each month. Right now, that money is going toward trying to get supplies to film in-person games as well as online games. So I very much do appreciate everyone who is interested in supporting. Every little bit helps, so thank you all very much. And of course, if none of these appeal to you, you can always just like and subscribe to the video because that alone does a lot to help us grow as a channel. So thank you all very much to all of our supporters. And one last quick shout out before we move on, and that is, of course, to the Underground Sea. We started collaborating with them last week. They have been doing small, little bite-sized primers and reviews for some of our decks. They shouted us out on their news source, and they are doing a primer for our Dina deck. So if you haven't seen that, please do check it out. But they're a phenomenal group, and if you are interested in what we do on this channel, you may also be interested in what they do on their channel. So they are a phenomenal group of people to work with, and I'm very grateful that we've had the chance to work with them and get to share some of our content. So if you haven't checked them out already, please do so. But without any further ado, I suppose it's time that we jump into our deck tech. So our random card of the week is less of a random card and actually a suggested card. It was suggested by Neil Arnold on YouTube, and the suggested card for the week is Selvala, Heart of the Wilds. Now, Selvala is a very popular commander. She's a very scary commander. I've played against her a lot myself, so I know that she can be incredibly powerful. And when this was suggested, I was very interested to see if we could do this on a budget, especially because Selvala alone is over 10% of our budget. So Selvala, Heart of the Wilds is 1 green for a 2/3 elf scout. And she says, whenever another creature enters the battlefield, its controller may draw a card if its power is greater than each other creature's power. And it also has green and tap, add X mana in any combination of colors, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. So, obviously, since we were given a random card as a legendary, we of course had to make that legendary our commander, so Selvala is going to be leading up the deck today. And let's take a look at some themes that we have in this deck. The first theme that we're going to run into is we want cheap creatures that are very large. So, for example, we have Lupine Prototype, which is a 2-mana 5/5. Now, obviously, being a 2-mana 5/5, it is going to have a drawback. And the main drawback here is that it can't attack or block unless a player has no cards in hand. So it's really not going to be doing much. It's very rare in Commander for players to have no cards in hand, but it's not impossible. But really what this is going to do is it's very cheap. It triggers Selvala. If we can play Selvala on turn 3, play this on turn 4, it's unlikely our opponents are going to have anything that's a 5/5 or bigger, so we can draw a card. And then Selvala can immediately tap for 5 mana, giving us a bunch of mana back. So we have a ton of creatures in here that are very cheap, have a massive drawback, but are a very large power and toughness. So we really just want to be able to kind of ramp out some bigger creatures. That's our main game plan here. And then our second theme for this deck are those big creatures that we want to ramp into. So for example, we have Galta Primal Hunger, which is 10 green for a 12/12 Elder Dinosaur. This spell costs X less to cast, where X is the total power of creatures you control, and it has Trample. So in the example we were using earlier, if we have Lupine Prototype on turn 4, we cast it, we have Selvala, we tap Selvala, and we make 5 mana. Galta is now costing 5 mana less because of Lupine Prototype, 2 mana less because of Selvala, so that's 7 mana off of the 12, meaning we only need 5 mana to cast it, and Lupine Prototype gives us that 5 mana to cast it. So we could, on turn 4 in this deck, have Selvala on board, cast Lupine Prototype, activate Selvala, and cast Galta Primal Hunger. And at that point, our opponents are staring down a massive 12/12 trample on turn 4. There's a good chance we can get in at least one attack before anyone's able to deal with it. So this deck can get some very large creatures very, very quickly and just put up a massive threat before anyone really has the chance to react. And that's really what we're all about. And then finally, we do have a last theme for this deck, and this one's a little bit obvious, but we need some card draw. We need to be able to get our opponents to actually take some damage, so we need Trample. And so that is represented here by Garruk's Uprising, which is 2 and a green for an enchantment that says, when Garruk's Uprising enters the battlefield, if you control a creature, power 4 or greater, draw a card. We almost always will. It also gives creatures we control Trample, incredibly useful because Lupine Prototype doesn't have Trample, but it could probably benefit from it. And then whenever a creature power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. So again, this should, throughout the course of a game, draw us a ton of cards. We want to play massive green creatures, replace them with Garruk's Uprising so we can play more massive green creatures. Really, this deck only has one major plan. I know we have 3 themes, but the major plan is just to stomp over our opponents with massive green monsters. And so with that in mind, let's take a look at some key cards in this deck. So the first key card that I want to talk about is Sereth the Viper's Fang, a relatively new card from Midnight Hunt. It's 2 green for a human warlock, 3/4, and it says, other tapped creatures you control have Death Touch. Other untapped creatures you control have Hexproof, and you can pay 1 and tap it to untap another target creature or land you control. So this is useful almost at every single type line on this card. If we are attacking with all of our creatures, we're giving them all Death Touch, which becomes incredibly important because most of our creatures have Trample. And if you're not aware of how Trample and Death Touch work together, the way that Magic rules work is that you only need to deal lethal damage to a creature before you start trampling over. Lethal damage from a Death Touch creature is always 1 damage. So we could have our Galta as a 12/12 be blocked by something with 10 toughness. It would do 1 damage to the creature, Death Touch would kill it, and then the other 11 would go to our opponent, even though their creature had 10 toughness. So it's a really absurd interaction, and it really helps us to give our entire team Death Touch. That's incredibly useful. But on top of all of that, it gives our untapped creatures hexproof. So if we are not attacking, or we have any creatures that don't have haste they can't attack, our opponents are going to really struggle to get rid of them because they can't target them. So we can basically keep Selvala around with hexproof until we need her, and then we tap her. Now, that leads us to our last line of text here on Sereth, which is arguably the most important. We can untap another creature or land. So we could tap Selvala for, say, 5 mana, because we have a Lupine Prototype, pay 1 of that mana to untap Selvala, pay another 1 of that mana to tap her again, and go to 8 total mana. So this allows us to double dip on Selvala, also maybe double dip on some of our attackers, turn them from attackers into defenders if we need them, but it's also a great way to actually protect our creatures. So if we attack with everything, we tap Selvala for mana, and our opponents cast a spell to try to kill Selvala or to kill one of our attacking creatures, we can untap that creature, which then makes it untapped according to Sereth and gives it hexproof, which completely negates the effect of that removal spell. So I really can't talk up Sereth enough. I think she is probably like the all-star in this deck. She does literally everything we want. And if you have a Sereth, honestly, it's definitely worth slotting in. And I would kind of be interested in seeing her own deck. So if you guys have a Sereth deck that you would like to share, I would be more than interested to see it. So please do drop a link into the comments below, and I will be happy to check that out, because that might wind up being my own personal next deck to build. But enough about Sereth. I got a little bit sidetracked. So we'll move on to our next key card, and that is going to be Colossification. So Colossification is 5 green for an enchantment aura enchant creature. When Colossification enters the battlefield, you tap enchanted creature, and then enchanted creature gets +20/+20. So in this deck with Selvala on board, this is basically pay 7 mana and then get 20 mana from Selvala. Now, we're also not casting this on a 0 power creature, so even just casting it on something like Sereth gives us 23 mana from Selvala. If we cast it on something like Galta, we're talking about 32 mana. That is insane in this deck. And especially if we can put Colossification on, we'll say Galta again, make it a 32 power creature with trample, we can then untap that creature with Sereth and still use it to attack the turn Colossification comes down, making this very surprising for our opponents, and something that I definitely wouldn't want to deal with sitting at the table, so I imagine our opponents probably won't either. And then finally, our last key card in this deck is Return of the Wildspeaker. Now, there are a lot of similar cards that do what Return of the Wildspeaker does. There's things like Rishkar's Expertise. We talked about card draw from Garruk's Uprising earlier. But the reason I want to highlight Return of the Wildspeaker is because of the 2 different modes it has. Most of the time, we're going to pay 4 and a green for an instant and choose to draw cards equal to the greatest power among non-human creatures we control. So if we use our Galta example, we've got Colossification on it, we just casually draw 32 cards, which is insane for 5 mana. But sometimes we need to end the game. And so in that case, we might choose the other mode of Return of the Wildspeaker. Non-human creatures you control get +3/+3 until end of turn. This can be a great instant speed way to knock some people out of the game, because maybe they block just enough to survive, the trample, they're not expecting it to kill them, and then boom, all of a sudden we're adding 9, 12, 15 power to the attack, and someone just dies. So Return of the Wildspeaker is great on both halves of the card. Like I said earlier, we're really going to want it for the card draw, but it's not beyond what we're willing to do to just cast it for the overrun effect and win. So those are the key cards for this deck. The next piece of our deck tech is to take a look at some cool interactions in the deck, some cards that work super well together. And I'm going to be honest and upfront with you guys, it was kind of difficult to find just a pair of cards that work super well, mainly because everything just kind of works together. We just have a bunch of big creatures, we have a bunch of cards that want to increase our mana and things like that. So finding specifics was honestly a little difficult because everything works well together, but we were able to narrow it down to a couple. And the first one is actually Karametra's Acolyte and Gigantosaurus. So Gigantosaurus, another cheap spell that's a massive creature, so it's 5 green mana, so green, for a 10/10 dinosaur, and that is it. It is just a vanilla 10/10 for 5 mana, which is pretty impressive. That's kind of where we want to be. But if we combine that with Karametra's Acolyte, which is 3 and a green for a human druid, it's a 1/4, and it taps to add an amount of green to your mana pool equal to your devotion to green. So if we have Karametra's Acolyte and Gigantosaurus on the board, that is 6 green mana from just those 2 cards. And if we have Selvala on board on top of that, she gives us 10 from Gigantosaurus. So just 3 cards, Gigantosaurus, Karametra's Acolyte, and Selvala Heart of the Wilds, we can make 16 green mana. Actually, we would make 18 because Selvala would also count for Karametra. So those 3 cards alone combined make 18 total green mana, which is an absurd amount of mana. We can cast literally anything in our deck for that mana. In fact, we should probably be casting our entire hand at that point. So this can be a very powerful combination, and it's a nice backup in case Selvala gets taken out. People are very aware that Selvala needs to be killed pretty early on, so Karametra's Acolyte isn't going to get as much hate, so it might be a good backup, a good way to kind of keep rolling if we happen to lose our commander. And then our second cool interaction, we have Nissa Who Shakes the World and Genesis Hydra. So we talked a little bit earlier about wanting to get a ton of mana. One of the best ways to get a ton of mana is to use Nissa Who Shakes the World, because she is 3 green for a 5 loyalty legendary planeswalker, Nissa. And her static ability says, whenever you tap a forest for mana, add an additional green mana. So all of our forests are now tapping for double the mana. There's no better way to increase our mana than to double it. She can also +1 to put 3 +1/+1 counters on up to 1 target non-creature land you control. Untap it, it becomes a 0/0 elemental creature with vigilance and haste that is still a land. And she can -8. You get an emblem with lands you control have indestructible. Search your library for any number of forest cards, put them onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle your library. Really, we want her for that passive ability to tap forests for double mana. Getting the creature on her +1 is definitely not a bad thing, though. Being able to have a 3/3 with vigilance, always super useful. And if we're ever able to ultimate her, we have almost entirely forests in our deck because we are a mono green deck. We only have a handful of non-basics, so that ultimate gets us most of our lands into play. But really what we want to do, like I said, is use her for the mana. And to that end, we're going to combine her with Genesis Hydra, which is X green for a 0/0 plant Hydra. Genesis Hydra enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. And the big reason it combines with Nissa is when you cast this spell, reveal the top X cards of your library. You may put a non-land permanent card with converted mana cost X or less from among them onto the battlefield, then shuffle the rest of your library. So if we are able to produce, we'll say 8 mana with Nissa, so we have 4 forests, we can cast Genesis Hydra for X = 6, meaning that we are able to look at the top 6 cards of our library and put a non-land permanent that costs 6 or less into play. And that's just with 4 forests. If we get to the point where we have 6, 7, 8 forests, we're looking through a ton of cards in our deck. And not only looking through a ton of cards, getting to play the biggest, beefiest creature we possibly can for free. So these two work super well together in the sense that it really allows us to pick and choose what we want to cast from our deck. And not only are we getting a massive spell, it's important to remember too that Genesis Hydra gets that many +1/+1 counters. So we get a giant spell out of our library, and we get a giant Hydra. So this can be incredibly dangerous for our opponents, and definitely is a quick way to win the game. So that is the majority of our deck tech. The last piece of this is going to be the budget for the deck, and I'm not going to lie, we came really close to our budget limit for this deck, $98.72. And I do think that a good portion of that is because our commander costs $10.91, which you really can't replace Selvala with another commander and expect the deck to run the same. You could always replace her with any other mono green commander and just play mono green Stompy, but her ability to generate as much mana as she does is what makes this deck really run. So it's very difficult for me to suggest dropping her for another commander. Obviously, you could always drop her for Seraph, but again, that's not going to give you the mana production. And then you've got creatures like Lupine Prototype that don't really do much if you don't have Selvala. So if you're looking to cut money out of this deck, I don't think Selvala is the place to do it, but we do have a handful of $4 to $5 cards, including Nissa, who we just looked at, that could be worth cutting to bring the price down if that's something that you are interested in. On the other hand, if you are interested in increasing the price of the deck, we do have some suggestions for some out-of-budget upgrades that you could try to include in here to try to make things a little bit stronger. And the first of which is going to be Green Sun's Zenith, which is X and a green for a sorcery, and it's $25.52. But it says search your library for a green creature card with converted mana cost X or less, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library, and then shuffle Green Sun Zenith into its owner's library. So it has X in the casting cost, which is fine because we can make a ton of mana, and it lets us search our library for a green creature and put it directly into play. That's incredibly useful. We can go ahead and search for Galta if we need a massive finisher. We can go ahead and search for Sereth to give hexproof and try to protect our creatures. We can go ahead and just search for Lupine Prototype if we don't have a ton of mana and we need to build up that mana quickly. So Green Sun Zenith is an incredibly powerful card, and it does pretty much everything we want to do in this deck, but it is $25, so it's definitely out of budget. And then our second card that we want to look at this week is very similar to Green Sun Zenith. It's Finale of Devastation, which is currently $35.65. So it is well above our price range. That's over a third of our deck's cost right there. But Finale of Devastation, again, has X in the casting cost, so X green for a sorcery. And it says search your library and or graveyard for a creature card with converted mana cost X or less and put it onto the battlefield. If you search your library this way, shuffle it. If X is 10 or more, creatures you control get +X and gain haste until end of turn. So if we are able to pump just 10 mana into the X, so 12 mana total, we can go ahead and get pretty much any creature out of our deck, Galta being the only real exception. And then all of our creatures get +10, and haste until end of turn. That is one of the easiest ways to finish out the game. And I didn't talk about this too much, but there are some cards in the deck, like Great Oak Guardian, for example, that when they enter the battlefield, they actually untap all of our creatures. So we can tap Selvala, tap our mana creatures, cast Finale of Devastation, get Great Oak Guardian maybe, give everything +10, untap it, and then just swing all out and win the game. So that's a main reason why Finale of Devastation would be a good upgrade and a good include, but like I said, we don't have the budget for it, so unfortunately it is not in this deck. But those are our only out-of-budget upgrades, and that is the end of our deck tech, but we do still have a gameplay video as well. So what we're going to do is see how this game actually goes. We're going to jump into a game with some opponents and see how our deck performs. So this week, we are joined by Shawn, who is playing his Kumena Tyrant of Orazca deck, Jason, who is playing his Aura Skyclave Hierophant deck, and Bilal, who is playing Lenore Autumn Sovereign. So we're running up against 3 different tribal decks this week, which is interesting. We have Shawn playing his Merfolk tribal deck. This is probably the one that worries me the most because Merfolk tend to be very evasive, tend to draw a ton of cards, and they can actually get very big very quickly, especially because Kumena himself puts +1/+1 counters on Merfolk. So I think that's probably the one I'm most scared about this week. After that, we do have Jason's Cleric tribal deck with Aura, and this is another one I'm not particularly concerned that it's going to outrace us because I think we can probably keep up with the life gain. The one thing I'm concerned about with this deck is that I know clerics are very good at sacrificing themselves, and if they have effects that sacrifice other players' creatures, I don't think we're going to be able to keep up with that. So I think our creatures could keep pace with the life gain, but I don't think we can keep up with any sacrificing because once we lose Selvala, once we lose some of our big mana creatures, there's not much we're going to be able to do. And then finally, we have Bilal's Lenore Autumn Sovereign deck, which I believe is human tribal, but it's also a bit more +1/+1 counter tribal. He wants to focus a little bit more on the counters. So I'm interested to see how that goes. I think that we will outpace this deck in the early game, but if the game goes super late, I'd imagine his creatures probably start to get bigger than ours. So all of the decks this week I think are going to put up a pretty good fight, but Again, I've played against Selvala before. I know she can be incredibly powerful, so I'm hoping we can just have that explosive start that I know this deck can have, and we'll see how it goes. So I hope you guys enjoy the video. Please do like and subscribe if you like the deck tech, if you like the gameplay, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, I get to go first, followed by Shawn, Jason, and Bilal. On my first turn, I play a forest. Shawn plays an island and then casts Benthic Biomancer. Jason plays a plains. Bilal plays a Path of Ancestry, tapped. I play a forest, cast a Wild Growth, enchanting a forest so that it taps for 2 green mana, and then I cast Lupine Prototype, a 5/5 that can't attack or block unless a player has no cards in hand. Shawn plays a forest, and then adapts Benthic Biomancer, putting a +1/+1 counter on it, drawing a card and discarding a card, before moving to combat and attacking Bilal for 2. On Jason's turn, he plays a swamp, and then casts a Soul's Attendant, gaining him a life whenever a creature enters the battlefield. Bilal plays a fortified village, tapped, and then casts the Ozolith, allowing him to put counters on it equal to the counters on his creatures that die, and then move them to new creatures at the beginning of combat. On my turn, I play a forest, and then cast my commander, Selvala, Heart of the Wilds. Shawn plays an island, and attacks Jason for 2. Then, in his second main phase, he casts a Combine Guildmage and a Mistcaller, gaining Jason a total of 2 life and pretty much negating the attack that just happened. On Jason's turn, he plays a swamp, and then casts Phyrexian Arena, which draws him a card and makes him lose a life on his upkeep. On Bilal's turn, he plays a Canopy Vista tapped. On my turn, I activate Selvala to make 5 green mana, allowing me to cast Genesis Hydra for X = 6, putting 6 +1/+1 counters on it, revealing the top 6 cards of my library, and putting a non-land permanent mana value 6 or less into play. Once the cards have been revealed, I choose to put Kogla the Titan Ape into play, drawing a card with Selvala, and then Kogla fights Combine Guildmage, killing the Merfolk. This also gains Jason 2 total life, and then I play Temple of the False God as my 4th land, so it can't tap for mana, unfortunately, and pass. Shawn plays an island and casts his commander, Kumena, Tyrant of Orazka, gaining Jason a life. In Jason's upkeep, he draws a card and loses a life, and then in his first main phase, he plays a Starlit Sanctum and casts Mangara the Diplomat, which draws Jason a card if he's attacked with 2 or more creatures, and if an opponent plays their second spell in a turn. Bilal plays a Bountiful Promenade, finally getting an untapped land, and then casts Rada Ghost Avenger, which gets a +1/+1 counter whenever an opponent's creature is tapped but isn't attacking, gaining Jason another life. I activate Selvala to make 7 green mana, triggering Rada, and then I cast Nissa Who Shakes the World, allowing my forest to tap for 2 green mana. I activate Nissa's +1 ability to untap a forest and turn it into a 3/3 elemental creature. After that, I cast a Sky Shroud Claim, searching my library for 2 forests and putting them into play untapped, drawing Jason a card from Mangara. I then move to combat, attacking Jason for 7 with Kogla, which destroys Phyrexian Arena on attacks, and I also attack Shawn for 6 with Genesis Hydra. In my second main phase, I cast Garruk Primal Hunter. I activate Garruk's -3 ability, killing the Planeswalker, but drawing 7 cards since I control a creature with 7 power. I then play a forest for turn, and cast a Sereth the Viper's Fang, which gives my tapped creatures Death Touch and my untapped creatures Hexproof. This also gains Jason a life. Luckily, I can also use Sereth to tap or untap another creature or land, And then, finally, I cast Sylvan Anthem, giving my green creatures +1/+1 and letting me scry 1 whenever a green creature enters the battlefield under my control. At the end of turn, Shawn activates Kumena, tapping 3 Merfolk to draw a card, putting 3 more counters on Radha. On Shawn's turn, he plays a forest and casts Mercfiend Liege, giving his creatures +1/+1 if they're green or if they're blue, as well as untapping them on each opponent's untapped step, gaining Jason a life. He then activates Kumena, tapping 3 Merfolk to draw a card, putting 3 more counters on Radha. On Jason's turn, he plays a Plains and casts Tabarak's Hope's Demise, which gets a +1/+1 counter whenever one of his creatures dies and draws him a card and loses him a life if that creature was a cleric. He then casts Rite of Oblivion, sacrificing Soul's Attendant to exile Nissa. This has him putting a counter on Tabarak's, drawing a card, and losing a life. Then at the end of turn, Shawn taps 3 Merfolk to draw a card, putting 3 more counters on Radha. Bilal plays a forest, and then casts Colonian Hydra, which doubles the +1/+1 counters on all his creatures when it attacks. Then, once again, at the end of turn, Shawn taps 3 Merfolk to draw a card, putting 3 more counters on Radha. On my turn, I play a forest, and then cast Colossification on Kogla, giving him +20/+20 and tapping him, putting another counter on Radha. But this then allows me to activate Selvala to make 27 green mana, putting 2 more counters on Radha. And with the mana, I cast Fierce Empath, searching my library for a creature, mana value 6 or greater, and putting it to hand. This lets me find a Great Oak Guardian. I also get to scry when the Empath enters and Jason draws a card and gains a life. I then cast the Great Oak Guardian, scrying 1, gaining Jason another life, and untapping all of my creatures, giving them +2/+2 until end of turn. After that, I cast Garruk's Uprising, drawing a card and giving all my creatures trample. And finally, I cast Overwhelming Stampede, giving all my creatures +29/+29 since Kogla is a 29 power creature. This lets me move to combat and knock everyone out with massive Death Touch and Trample creatures, winning me the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. We definitely became archenemy very, very quickly, and our opponents couldn't do anything. The game only lasted 6 turns. We were able to drop down just a ton of threats very, very quickly. And I think this very much goes to show the power that Selvala really has, even on a budget. Being able to just make an absurd amount of mana very quickly is difficult for any deck to really deal with. I do think that if we hadn't hit that Overwhelming Stampede and been able to win that turn, there's a good chance we probably died to Bilal's Radha on the board because it was about to get incredibly massive. But luckily, none of our opponents could really interact with us, and we just kind of went off. So that is something that can definitely happen with this deck. If you are interested in putting it together, I would keep that in mind. I would imagine once your opponents start to pick up on it, Selvala is probably going to die a lot, because in that game, if we didn't have Selvala, or if someone had killed her the turn we played her, we would not have done nearly as much as we tried to do. So that is a concern playing this deck. But overall, I think it performed super well. I'm very happy with how it turned out. And it's a budget Selvala list, which is not a common thing to see. So thank you everybody for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any suggestions for future videos or future decks that you would like to see, please do put them in the comments below. You can send them to me on Twitter, you can send them to me on Reddit, you can send them to me through email. But I am looking forward to a couple of decks that we have coming up that are suggested videos. So we have that to look forward to. But other than that, I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.